Welcome. We're very happy to have you here with us today for our coffee chat. My name is Amy Klaus. I'm a marketing manager for early childhood products here at Brooks Publishing, and I'm very happy to have Dr. Howard Goldstein and Dr. Elizabeth Kelley joining us today to talk about shared book reading. Before we start, I want to give listeners just a few tips for joining our webinar today. We recommend you close any applications that take any bandwidth just for a better viewing experience. And if you do have any audio problems, you can switch to phone call in the audio section of your webinar panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and type those into the question section of your webinar panel, and we'll take those at the end of the presentation. The slide handouts are in the handout section, and also there's a URL in the chat box if you'd rather download them from the internet. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll send out a link to that recording in tomorrow's follow-up email, and you'll also receive a link to your certificate in that follow-up email. So now with all of those logistics out of the way, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Goldstein.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about shared book reading and ways that you can optimize shared book reading. I have control over the slide, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. Hopefully, if I could figure out how to advance the slide. Okay. So why is shared book reading so important? We know that children enjoy reading books, families enjoy reading books, but they also learn a lot from books. It's also a great avenue for conversations between adults and children. Children learn to love books from the imaginative stories that builds on their fantasies and things like that. And it can set the stage for school success because the language that's in books is actually more complicated and more complex than the language that we usually use in oral interactions. And when we think about what children learn in terms of language, it helps children develop their vocabulary, their grammar, acquire their syntax. It helps with listening comprehension, which will relate later to reading comprehension. Being able to answer questions that require inferences. Just simply knowing about books and how they work in English from left to right, from top to bottom. It incorporates the kind of language that has contrasts that might help with phonological awareness, being able to blend sounds together to make words and segment words into sounds and so forth. And the idea of the correspondence between letters and sounds or alphabet knowledge, those are so critical to school success. Whoops, get ahead of myself. So the little acronym that we came up with for reading, how to read with your child. And one of the things that we want to encourage is something that typically happens pretty routinely, just naturally. Children like to read the same book over and over again, and that's a really healthy thing. Even in the interventions that we've developed, we use the same books on repeated occasions with instruction on vocabulary that we'll talk about later in it, and the use of decontextualized language and other ways that we've learned to share books. And it's an opportunity to engage with children while you're reading the books. So it's more than just reading the text. It's also having them ask questions and you asking questions and relating the books to their everyday lives and their past experiences and so forth. So just simply reading books is not really sufficient for optimizing language development. And we know that that's really important. In fact, many of you, most of you, probably have heard about the 30 million word gap. It stems from Betty Hart and Todd Risley's classic work in the field. This Meaningful Differences book from 1995 demonstrated these huge disparities in the homes of young children. between 12 and 36 months, you'll see that the cumulative effects in terms of the number of words and how much language they hear in their homes grows exponentially. And, you know, by the time, if we extrapolate to children starting preschool at, let's say, 48 months, the gap between our professional families, low-income families, was on the order of 30 million words. That's a huge disparity, and one that we can't make up given the amount of time that children spend in preschool. It's, you know, so we had to figure out what can we do about this. And there are really only two things that I can think of. And one of them is start early, do parent training, you know, work with infants and toddlers and their parents to stimulate and enrich the home language environment. And then we need to think about what can we do that can make learning in classrooms all that much more efficient around language. So this happens to be one of the graphics from a book of ours on forest friends. There's Pablo Porcupine and Suki Squirrel.
It's Faye Fox.
Yeah. Oh, that was Faye Fox. I'm sorry. So we've used shared book reading to teach vocabulary. So I'm going to have Beth talk about how we choose good words to teach and the process that we use for teaching words explicitly, all in the idea that what we can do is try to close that word gap as efficiently as possible by doing an effective job of teaching words in the context of storybooks. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Beth, to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, great. So as Howard mentioned, we've spent a lot of time working on what are the best ways to teach vocabulary during shared storybook reading. So what we wanted to share with you today were sort of some of our lessons learned, the things that we've kind of tried and have worked out, and how that might be something that you could apply when you're reading books with kids or working with teachers who read books with kids. And the first thing that we've spent a lot of time thinking about is if we're going to take the time to stop the storybook, talk about a word, teach a word, we want to make sure that we're choosing a really good word to teach, right? So Howard's mentioning this 30 million word gap. We can't teach all those words, but we can think about how do we teach words that are really going to maximize that child's language development and going to benefit them in terms of language comprehension and reading comprehension. So this is one of the ways that we've thought about how do you choose good words to teach. And so we've kind of operationalized this to think about teaching words that are new, so words that your kids don't already know, thinking about teaching words that are going to be useful. And here we've spent a lot of time in preschool. So words that are useful in preschool are words that are going to show up again. Those are words that are going to show up again in another storybook, or they're going to show up again in a conversation with an adult or a peer. They might be a word that's going to show up again during some sort of classroom routine, or might show up again in a conversation about emotions, right? That's something that happens a lot in preschool. So words that are new, words that are useful. And then we've also thought a lot about picking words that we can teach well. And so words that we can teach well in the context of shared storybook reading usually have something about the story that helps us teach it. So the word might be tied to a main event in the story, or it might be a word that shows up on a page that's illustrated really well, right? So one of the words that we teach is disappointed. And on that page, Suki Squirrel is sobbing and her tears are pouring off her face, and you could really talk about what she's feeling. So that's an example of a word that I can teach well in that storybook because I have a lot of support for it. So I'll take a click there. Yeah, okay. So when I work with teachers and speech pathologists and my college students about thinking about good words to teach, one of the things that we talk about is that there's sort of some really good choices and then some choices that are not as good. And I think we probably all have this experience is when you read a children's book, there's so many words in there you could teach that it's really about narrowing it down to what the best choices are. So in the blue box here, I have some of the words that really meet our criteria of new and useful and words we could teach well. So there's disappointed. You can see there's several social emotional words there, worried. There's some nice action words, speedy, search, horrible, explore. These are words that preschoolers, a lot of preschoolers don't necessarily know yet, but they're words that are going to be useful because they're going to show up again. And they're words that we can teach well in the context of that storybook. The words under the not as good column, you'll see that those tend to be words that are a little less frequent, words that probably kids aren't going to experience as often. They might be words that are really specific to one storybook or one experience, or not really going to show up again in the kid's life. And they're also words that might be really kind of hard to explain or teach well to a kid. So maybe those are good second grade words or fourth grade words or somewhere down the line. But if we're going to really focus on some great words, we want to teach those new, useful, easy to teach words. So the second piece here is, now that we've picked our good words, how are we going to teach them? And the work that Howard and I have done together really builds off a big evidence base to support that we really need to teach words explicitly. So in the context of a shared storybook reading, that means you stop, you say the word, you talk about the word, and then this is how we've designed our explicit instruction. So the first step is that you're going to teach with some sort of simple definition. Might be a more common synonym. So if we're going to teach enormous, I can use big as the definition. We're also going to make sure that we teach with some meaningful examples and real life contexts. So typically the storybook might provide you with a context for teaching that word, right? So in our Suki's sleepover surprise book, Suki's disappointed because her friends can't come over to play. So we can connect that meaningful example to real life contexts. So maybe the children in your classroom were disappointed because they didn't get to choose first for centers, or maybe you can tie it to some other classroom experience that really makes that word meaningful for them. Then the third one here in blue is this idea that kids are really going to need lots of opportunities to practice. So they need opportunities to hear these words in different contexts. They need opportunities to say these words and use these words in different contexts. And so that might be across the school day, but it might also be at home, thinking about ways that they can practice those words. So we have a little example here for the word giggle. And what we're going to show you is how you might kind of come up with your plan to talk about that word. So for the explicit teaching, we're going to stop and talk about the word. So listen to this word, giggle. Then we're going to teach with a definition. Giggle's pretty easy. Most of the kids will know laugh. So I can use laugh as my simple child-friendly definition for the word giggle. We can think about meaningful examples. So I made up an example here that maybe in this story, we've got a nice illustration. Our character Sarah is giggling at her silly friend. She is laughing at him. And then we can make connections between that target vocabulary word and things that would be meaningful real life connections in that child's life. So let's think of some things that make you giggle. What about if your mommy tickles you or your friend makes a silly face? So ways that the children can understand that new word in context that makes sense to them. This is actually an example from one of our storybooks. So it's just another example of how we put those pieces in action here. So I'll read a little bit for you. Howard, you can do the audience participation piece.
Okay, I'd be happy to.
So in our storybook, it says the forest friends were thrilled. Bobby let out a mighty roar. Fay Fox ran in circles on the forest floor. So the word we're teaching here is thrilled. So our instruction sounds like the forest friends are thrilled. They are excited to go to the carnival. Thrilled. Say thrilled.
Thrilled.
Thrilled means excited. Tell me, what word means excited?
Thrilled.
Good work. When are you thrilled? What about when you get a present or your friends come over to play? I bet that makes you feel excited. Now lift the flap. So Howard's gonna, I think if you give it a click, Howard, there we go. Look, these boys are at a birthday party. They are excited. They are thrilled. Tell me, what does thrilled mean?
Thrilled means excited.
Excited, that's right. Now, Howard was a little more cooperative than maybe your first time through with the preschooler.
I've
But
heard this story before.
Yeah, that's right. This was one of our repeated readings, right? So he was familiar. But I think, I think our point here with this example is that if you give those opportunities for a brief explicit instruction that includes a definition, a connection to the story, some real life examples, that's what's going to really optimize that shared storybook reading for vocabulary knowledge. So this last slide here, I think these are some of the big lessons that we've learned thinking about how to do great shared storybook reading. One thing is that doing shared storybook reading is really feasible. It fits into a lot of contexts, family contexts, fits into classroom routines, it fits into, I'm a speech pathologist, so it fits into those clinical sessions. It's really effective at supporting language development, specifically some of this vocabulary development. And one of the big lessons here, now that is Suki Squirrel there, that we've learned is that you can really teach a lot of these challenging words. So right now we teach 4 challenging words, 4 of those words in each storybook. And what we've seen is that kids really learn a lot of words when we spend time doing this explicit instruction. So I think that's my section there, Howard. Did you have anything you wanted to say about this one?
Well, I want people to prepare some questions, and I think, Amy, are you going to come back? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yep, I'll come back now. So thank you. That was really helpful. I have a preschooler at home, so those are good tips for me for all the storybook reading that we're doing right now. I wanted to let all the listeners know that we're giving away a free copy of the Story Friends Specialist Kit. So you'll see some of the books on the screen. Those are the books that Howard and Beth were talking about and showing examples from. So we're going to pick one live attendee randomly, and we'll email you after the presentation. And then if you'll move to the next slide, there's a 20% discount code for anyone who's interested in ordering any of the book publishing books. You can use that discount code through the end of June. And then just to let you know, we are also having more coffee chats throughout the month of May. So we encourage you to check out our lineup. On Monday, we're having one on the importance of oral language. So it's sort of a related topic. And then a final slide, just Brooks has gathered some COVID-19 resources to help during this time. So there's some activity sheets you can share with parents to do at home. There's some other previously recorded webinars that you may be interested in. So I encourage you to check those out. So now, and if you do have a question now, please feel free to type it in the question box, and I will read some of these to Howard and Beth. Let's see. We have a listener who's asking, do you recommend some readings first with the child without any commentary and then add in the word exploration once the book becomes familiar?
Well, actually, I'm not sure if Beth would agree, but the interaction should just come naturally and should occur from the very first reading of the book. With our story friends, we typically have the same book, for the week, and they listen to the book 3 times. And when we introduce a new vocabulary word the first time, they're really slow to respond, and the second time, they're a little quicker. By the third time, they can answer those little questions like, what makes you, when are you thrilled? At the beginning, it's like, they're really thinking through this, but it takes a long time for them to respond. So the redundancy from the very outset, I think, actually is very helpful.
Well, and I do
also
agree
have been very cognizant about the fact that we don't want to interrupt the story too often, but easily, interrupting 4 to 6 times in a book that tends to be about 20 or so pages long really isn't all that awkward in terms of losing the thread of the story.
And I do agree with Howard that I would start working on those vocabulary and doing that interaction and conversation the first time I read the book. And I think that you can, a couple reasons. One is there are some times that kids will let you read a book to them over and over and over, but we've learned that about 3 times and the kids are ready for a new book. So you want to take advantage of that time when they're really engaged and excited. The other thing I think is that word study can really complement, that explicit vocabulary instruction can really complement them understanding what's going on in the story and engaging what's going on in the story. So maybe at the beginning, you're doing a lot more talking about what those words mean the first time you read the book. But as Howard mentioned, by the second or third time, they're going to do a little more talking. So yeah, I would think that I would start talking about those vocabularies the very first time I read the book.
I think it even models for the children the idea that it's okay for them to ask, when they don't understand a word. So if there's more of that comprehension monitoring going on, that's going to aid in vocabulary development as well.
Thank you. So we have sort of a related question to what you were just saying. When reading a book, if a child asks about a word that's not on your list, do you go into an explanation about the word in the same way?
Go ahead, Beth.
Yeah. So I would say yes. I would say if there's a word that a child's interested and engaged on, that you would maximize. I mean, you just take advantage of that teaching. One of the things I think is that we describe the kind of explicit teaching you do for these kinds of words that really need a lot of explanation. Sometimes what grabs a kid's attention might be a word that you explain just by pointing to the picture, right? So if they're like, what's a treasure chest? You're like, oh, this right here. This is the treasure chest. See how it has all the, gold and jewels in it. So it could be a quicker explanation or a different kind of explanation depending on the kind of word. But I think that when you see kids start that, and we see this in our studies, when they go all of a sudden to being really curious about words and say, wait, what does that one mean? That's exactly the kind of, meta-linguistic knowledge we want to foster in them. So I would definitely, if a child brings up a word, take the time to talk about it.
Great. We have a listener who's going to be starting virtual story time. Do you have any recommendations for making it more successful?
Yes, plan ahead. So I would say that, when Beth describes the process of identifying words and coming up with definitions, it sounds easy, but it isn't so easy. We've done lots of workshops with teachers, and I really enjoy doing that and ask teachers to bring in books from their classroom, and I'll read a book and I'll say, while I'm reading this book out loud, I want you to write down all the words that your children probably don't know. And inevitably, they come up with a list of like 15, maybe 20 words from the book. And then I say, okay, are you going to teach 15 words? And they say, oh, that's too many. And then I say, well, how many is the right number? And, we usually end up with around 4 plus or minus 2. And then I say, okay, pick your 4 words. And then there ends up being a lot of discussion about how do you select those words. And we discuss the number of the criteria that you would use, but applying them at the spur of the moment when you're reading a book is very difficult to do. And then I say, okay, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to pick your 2 words and write child-friendly definitions. And they have a really hard time doing that. At the end of 2 minutes, oh, wait, I'm not quite done yet. Well, in the context of reading to your child, you don't have time to, pause for 2 minutes in order to come up with definitions. So the only way I think you can do this well is by planning ahead, and it doesn't matter if you get all the right words, but if you just sort of have that idea, I want words that are going to be useful in the future, that come up in a lot of different contexts instead of really specific story contexts, and words that I can define easily with synonyms or short phrase. Those are the things that you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think the plan ahead piece is huge, and it's something that we continue to learn that you can't do this well on the spur of the moment. I mean, no matter how much experience you have reading books with kids. The other thing that I would say we've learned is, our storybooks and our lessons are pre-recorded, and kids are listening under headphones and responding. And one of the things that is sort of magical about this preschool, early school age time is they will absolutely respond given
Yeah.
the chance. So I think if I were planning virtual story time, I'd give them chances to say the words. I'd give them chances to do a gesture that went with the word, or do something, even if they're watching it recorded or virtually, or however you're presenting it, because that really will engage them, and that interaction piece, I think, will keep them listening and motivated, but also help them understand that word. So
Great, good tips. Do you have any tips for how teachers might engage parents to do this with their children, especially parents that might struggle with literacy themselves?
mm-hmm.
So we've actually tried a number of different things for just simply having them practice the words that are in our books. We had really clever ideas, like, having children wear a little sticker that has Bobby Bear on it and says, "Ask me what enormous means," thinking that children would wear that home and parents would say, "What does enormous mean?" And the child would have, practice, "That means very big." Really? What else is enormous? It turns out that parents are very limited in their their knowledge and their persistence in doing that, to the point that children are getting a whole lot of practice. We ended up essentially creating mini books that were based around our stories. These are, you saw the text on each, there's basically 4 lines of rhyming text on each page. And, we could put a little instruction at the bottom of certain pages about the words that they can practice with their children. And for parents that have limited literacy skills, having books that the kids know about, having the kids tell the story, to have those types of interactions is perfectly fine as well.
Yeah. One resource that I've used a little bit with families is, if you're able to do something with the student and what Howard's saying, then the child can sort of take the lead on that shared storybook reading, so that the child says, "Let me tell you the story of this book. Let me tell you what's happening." I think that it takes a little of the pressure off, that it's more that we've called it like child recruitment, that the child's recruiting the parent and saying, "Hey, come do this with me." Versus, as a parent, I don't really want one more thing that I need to accomplish.
Yeah.
But if my kid comes to me and says, "Hey, this is something I'm excited about," that helps. I also think, if I were working with parents right now too, the ways that you could hook them up with things that exist at their library, or they can sit together and watch somebody reading that story together, and then have a conversation about the story, and we'd still capture a lot of those great language-rich conversations about books.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. A question from another listener. In your experiences, do you hear carryover of specific vocabulary use in conversation with preschoolers after you've done your instruction?
Yeah, we do. We hear cute stories from the teachers all the time about children using the words. Sometimes parents also reporting using the words. We also do tests, like, at the end of the year, we might do a retention test on the words that most of the children learned. Children aren't actually giving us definitions of all these words that we teach, but more than half of them at this point, which is pretty impressive, with a pretty difficult type of test of their word knowledge. The retention data is actually quite good. Once children learn words, they tend not to forget them, even if they're not all that frequent in everyday context.
Great, thank you. We have a question about how to give a definition for a target word. So this listener says they learned that it's good to use the correct semantic category. For example, when someone is thrilled, it means they feel excited. This style of definition is found in the Collins Co-Build Dictionary. What are your thoughts on this method of offering a definition?
So when we pick definitions, we're specifically picking definitions to teach in this context of shared storybook reading. So I think that point about semantic category or parts of speech is certainly important. We teach verbs as definitions for verbs. But with preschoolers, we have prioritized it being a child-friendly definition, even if it's not a complete definition. So as an example for disappointed, we teach disappointed means sad. Well, that's not exactly what disappointed means, but we use the context of the story and our real world examples and those repeated opportunities to learn and practice for the kids to really refine. Okay, disappointed means sad that you didn't get something you wanted, or sad because you thought something was going to happen and it didn't. We don't teach such a long, complicated definition. We prioritize a simple definition and then help them refine their deep knowledge through that other instruction.
You know, and we don't always get it right. I mean, I think about words like wise. So our definition for wise was smart. Turns out that children didn't know what smart meant. You know, so we really kind of have to try things out, and you know, that's the benefit of the development of Story Friends. We have tried out these words and the definitions and the story context, and when they didn't work, we improved upon them or changed out the words and things like that.
Great. We have a couple questions about Story Friends. So what's the recommended age range for Story Friends?
I'd say we primarily have used it with children in their pre-K year. You know, so you're talking about 3.5 to 5.5 essentially. I think that many kindergartners would get a lot out of these stories because the vocabulary, if they haven't been exposed to it, still would be novel for them. You know, but you know, by the end of kindergarten, they're into their pre-decodable books and things like that probably as well. The books are also book series, so that we have the same characters in 9 books plus some review books.
Great. And if you're interested in learning more about Story Friends, I put in your handout section, there is a sampler that has lots of information about showing you some of the examples of the books and talking more about the program. And I'll include a link in our follow-up email tomorrow. We have a video of one of the books being read, so you can see a book from beginning to end and hear the audio instruction that goes with it. We have a question about the research. You mentioned doing 3 rereads. Have you done any research for children with special needs and finding that they needed more than 3 rereads?
Do you want to take that one, Beth?
Well, sure. So I will say that most of the kids that we have done our research with are children who have limited language. So language that's below what might be expected for their age. And that has included children who speak multiple languages, included children who maybe have an IEP for a young child with developmental delay. So we have included a wide variety of children in our research studies. And what we've done is stuck with really those 3 repeated readings because it seems to us that fits nicely with the classroom routine, and usually the kids are ready for a new book. But what we've added in is we have some review books. So they listen to 3 different books across 3 weeks, and then the 4th week, they spend some time with review and practice, where they review all the words that were in those. And I think that what we've seen is that some of the children who have the most limited languages in our study might learn fewer words, or maybe they would benefit from a little extra review, or sometimes we talk about some of the times at the classroom, the teacher can do a little extension with those kids, but we haven't changed the way that we deliver Story Friends necessarily. And I think for me, having interacted with these kids in studies, I'm always kind of surprised that some of the kids with the language, you think, oh, maybe this is too hard. It's not. They can learn these really challenging words, and there's something really exciting for them to have to acquire these new words that are kind of these new powerful words that they can use in these new contexts. So we have some evidence that it works pretty well with some kids with special needs, but it's very flexible that you could increase the dosage if you needed to.
So if I were to think about this in a tiered system of support, I would think that instead of having them do more listens to the story the way it is, we might have a child who's not making much progress seeing one-on-one with the idea that, if we just give them more time to respond or an extra prompt to respond, and you can do that with our pre-recorded books by just, hitting pause on our MP3 player or tape deck or whatever. I think that probably would be a preferred method than just giving them more of the same.
Makes sense. So just two more questions to take. Do you have a recommendation for the best age to introduce chapter books to children?
I don't know. I go to my public librarians for these kinds of questions all the time, but I don't know when I would introduce chapter book, partly because chapter books range so much in difficulty. Like in my house, we were reading Magic Tree House books and we're reading Harry Potter chapter books. So I don't have an age, but I feel like that would be like a children's librarian. I would call up and say, when do you start introducing those?
Yeah, in a sense, our books are kind of like precursors to chapter books because it's the same characters, with each chapter essentially being a new predicament that they get themselves into and a little moral of the story. So I never thought about it as being chapter books, but it's, and it does have some of the same qualities to it, doesn't it?
Interesting. And then we have one listener said they're familiar with the Hart and Risley study from 1995. Do you know if there's been any more recent studies?
Yes, there have been a number of different studies. I think the largest scale study was done by Joe Gilkerson and the people in the Lena organization, where they were able to record what's happening in the home language environment with a device that estimates the child's number of words that they produce and the number of words that they hear from adults, and as well as background TV or media noise and things like that. And essentially, with a much larger sample, the results are, essentially the same. There are these differences, these disparities in the home language environment that tend to be associated with socioeconomic status. There are a number of other references as well, people looking at younger children and than Hart and Risley even started with.
Thank you. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Howard and Beth, for presenting. This was really interesting. Just as a reminder, there'll be a link to the recording in the follow-up email tomorrow, as well as a link to your certificate in that email. And I'll also,
this is a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting us, Amy.
Thank you,
yeah,
Amy.
Thank you. That was great. We hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.